Welcome to number 60 regarding men. 60 times we've done this. And I'm joined today by Janice Fiamengo and Paul Elam, both of whom are probably my favorite red pill analysts of all time. So it's good to be together, and it's good to talk about the draft today. Selective service. Indeed. And selective service to me is probably one of the best indicators of how gynocentric our culture really is, and how male disposability is a reality. I mean, just think about it. We're going to select these guys, we're going to make them sign up, and these are the guys who are going to have to go and fight just in case we have a war, right? That's pretty gynocentric. But let me tell you a story. When I was in high school in the late 1960s, I was getting about being 18 years old, and the war in Vietnam was going on. And we would hear every day, 25 young men died in such and such place. Or another day, 15 men died. Another day, 50. The average was 25 young men dying every day. 10,000 plus young males dying every year. That's a lot. And we would sit there, my guy friends and I, and say, yeah, so-and-so died from the high school, next to us. Or so-and-so died from the neighborhood, used to live down there. Somebody's brother died such and such. And it was like overwhelming, really. I mean, when you think about it, it's really overwhelming because we'd hear about these deaths all the time. Well, in the selective service genius, they decided to make things fair. And that's literally the reason they gave it, was to make things fair. They were going to have a lottery. And the lottery would be set up so that they would choose numbers for people. And based on your number, you would either go into the service or not have to go in the service. And so what they did was they had this stage with this big rotating ball filled with numbers, right? And they had some congressman from New York, I think, up there, and he would spin the thing and put his hand in and not look and pull it out and say, number such and such, right? And based on that number, you were more likely to be killed or not likely to be killed. So imagine the experience of a young man watching that guy pull numbers out of that, knowing his brother just got pulled and he's number 5, because I think it was under 140, you had to go. But above 140, you were safe. So imagine all these deaths around us, and then hearing this lottery thing, just taking chances. Oh, it's a chance, will you be the one that gets killed or not? But guess what? No women were chosen. Not a one. In fact, in Vietnam, 58,000 plus young men were killed. How many women? 8.
Yep.
8 women. They were all nurses who died on things like helicopter crashes or this or that. And 58,000 young men died. Oh boy. So fast forward to the future now. And the other thing about the whole selective service thing is that those lotteries became a piece of research. Researchers looked at that and said, oh, look, we have a random sample of young men. And they started doing research on those men who were chosen to go and those men who weren't, and the differences in their lives. They found out all sorts of crazy stuff. Your mortality rate went up if you were chosen lower. How about that? 13% increase in the rate of suicide for men who were chosen to go. 8% increase in the motor vehicle deaths of those chosen. All kinds of things came up. And 15% less income your second year back from service. So, and that research, I don't think too many people know about that kind of research, but it's out there. At any rate, now the selective service in all its wisdom is talking about having women be a part of selective service. How about that? In fact, John McCain and somebody else started a commission to determine whether we should have women in the draft or not. And that's been going on for I don't know how many years. The commission went on for, typical commission length of 2, 3, 4 years. I forget.
I think
exactly
it was 3 years. I think it was started in 2017, if I'm remembering correctly.
And NPR has this article about this commission and all these things. It's an 18-paragraph article. and they talk about all this stuff about the commission and what they've done. And yes, maybe it's time to have women in the military. And the last two paragraphs of the article, what do they say? They say that NCFM sued the government and won and said, we have to have females in the selective service. So it's like, why would they just tag that in at the end? Why not make that a part of the article to begin with? But anyway, there's so much to discuss about this whole selective service thing. I know you guys are champing at the bit. Where do we go from here?
I think it's part of a larger discussion of women in the military. Is, we are definitely averse to having in this society an honest discussion about women in the military. And they do have a history in the military. The first woman enlisted in the Army in 1917, or the first woman who enlisted as a woman was allowed to enlist in 1917. There were more after that. In 1948, after Pearl Harbor, they formed the Women's Army Corps, which was a really good idea because it formed a segregated branch of the service. And I can give you an abundance of reasons: upper body strength, prone to fractures, pregnancy. I mean, you can go down the list of reasons why women should not serve alongside men in the military, particularly in wartime. And to me, I don't even think that there's any arguing this. And for the feminists out there who I always hear them saying, "Oh, quit whining about the selective service. There's no draft anymore." Well, look, as long as women can point out that they couldn't vote until 1920, I think it's pretty much fair ground to talk about an all-male selective service.
Well said.
Would like to share part of my experience in the service. I came in after they ended, or right as they were ending the Women's Army Corps. In the mid-1970s. It officially ended in 78. But during that time, when we would go on field maneuvers, we would have all the men pitching in. We had to put up mess tents. We had to put up hospital tents. We had to put up headquarters tents, build things, dig latrines, do all these things that go in. A lot of manual labor that goes into setting up, 2,000 people in the field. It's quite an operation. And during that time, the women would be sitting under trees in the shade, complaining. And then after we were done doing all the work, they would look at how many spaces for women inside tents to sleep were needed and kick the guys out to sleep outside so that women could have a spot sheltered in the tent. And on top of this, if you complained about it, you were subject to an Article 15, which is the military's non-judicial form of punishment. You would be brought up on charges, and if you didn't agree to whatever punishment they wanted to give you for the Article 15, you were subject to court-martial. It was a total gag order all the time, and the double standards were rampant, absolutely rampant, everywhere you went in the military. I think women should be subject to the draft if we're going to have one. But I also think that women should not be put into combat alongside men. I think that's dangerous for men. And I think Fred Reed, and I will try to dig up the article and put it into the links below. Fred Reed wrote some years ago about a Pentagon report that outlined everything that the military knows about women in combat. They cannot keep up with men. They don't have the upper body strength. They're subject to all kinds of injuries that men don't typically get. They become burdens in the field. And we don't notice this as much in the Middle East in these battles because we're dealing mostly with mechanized units. They're going around in jeeps. They don't have to cut through jungle like they did in Vietnam. It's a different combat theater, different combat environment there than you see. But in many combat situations, women are luggage. That's what they are in those situations. It's not meant to be insulting. But we're talking about people's lives on the line here. And you have to count in the military, you have to count on the guy next to you to save your ass. And he's depending on you. If you're distracted trying to rescue women who can't keep up or carrying the materials for them or taking care of them when they got injured going over a fence or something like that, then this is a real problem, and it's a real deadly problem. And the guys in the military know even now, and we saw this, who was the Private Jessica Lynch? Do you guys remember
the name?
Yes.
She got caught behind lines. She apparently didn't fight very well, got captured, and they committed unthinkable amounts of energy into rescuing this woman that they would not do for men. And the word was in the military at the time that if you got caught out, you better hope that they figured out and came and got you, unless you were a woman. Right. If you were a MIA woman, they would go to the ends of the earth.
Yep.
To find.
In fact, it was prioritized. You know, they would, if there were multiple missing persons, if it was a woman, she'd be first. You know.
Exactly. And so we have a problem in that even out of command decisions like that, chivalry becomes the priority.
That's it.
Over the lives of combat soldiers. This is a real mess of a problem.
Sure
so
is.
My take on this, if you're going to draft people, if you're going to enslave people, we'll just put it that way. If you're going to enslave people for military purposes, everybody should be subject to it. But I don't believe that the idea of women fighting side by side with men, absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And it's already cost lives to do it.
Yes.
Yeah, this whole issue it's one of these, it's a kind of a symptom of where we have come in our discussions and the decisions we've made about gender equality in our societies, because whatever happens now is a mess. If Congress does not decide to take the advice of this committee and to change the rules or the construction of the Selective Services Act in order to admit women, then that enshrines a system whereby women have certain rights in American society without the accompanying obligation. And so that's a big symbolic problem. But on the other hand, if Congress does take the advice of the committee and the Selective Service is open to women, in the case of, God forbid, a war where people need to be drafted, I mean, what is it actually going to look like? And we just know that there are going to be all sorts of reasons why women would not be drafted into combat roles. There are good reasons why they shouldn't be, exactly as you were saying, because the danger to their fighting male comrades. I read about a study in 2015, I think it's a Marine Corps study, extensive one, that found that, in 69% of the combat, what's the roles or I don't know the actual word, tasks, I guess, that combat squads have to be evaluated on, that mixed groups were 69%, or mixed groups were far less effective in 69% of those tasks evaluated. So in terms of rescuing fallen comrades, in terms of, just fighting capacity in general. So we know that mixed squads don't work as well. And we know that, yes, chivalry comes into it. Men are expected, and in most cases are quite willing to take up the slack, and that endangers them. It makes the fighting unit far less effective, therefore, raising the possibility that a war might be lost because of that. I mean, it's just, it's such a bad idea. And yet the climate, the feminist environment that we operate in makes it impossible to talk about those things openly. So there would be all sorts of excuses made for why women would not be in combat. That would mean then, of course, the draft would not have the same impact on women as it has on men. because obviously the risk to life is the major issue of a draft. Women would be kept out of those combat positions, and yet we wouldn't even be able to make that clear. There would be this celebration of all that women bring to the military. It would always be covered over the manner in which women are not doing their part. So yeah, it's just an impossible situation. I think it's a symptom of where we have come in giving women, in talking about equal rights, and not making women shoulder their fair share of burdens, but not even being able to admit that that's the case. I have a chapter in my book by a military man. I think he kept himself anonymous. I think he was in the New Zealand Armed Forces. And his experience there, being fairly high up in the service and of training women and dealing with women, it was exactly as one would expect. It created all sorts of problems for men, involving, of course, charges of sexual harassment, complaints made, complaints of discrimination, all sorts of flirting, he said, and testing of boundaries and the use of women's sexual power to get their way. But then if things didn't go their way, then complaints. Men, he said, are walking on eggshells constantly. All sorts of special measures had been taken in the New Zealand forces to make the environment welcoming for women. Even the standards had been lowered, of course, the physical standards, in order for them to be admitted. He said that it was a nightmare, and yet the rhetoric about how the Army needed to bring women in because women brought a special skill set. That rhetoric was heard constantly. Anyone who queried what that special skill set was, obviously it wasn't physical, because it was demonstrably the case that women were inadequate physically, but it was their emotional intelligence.
That's very important in combat.
Yeah. It beggars belief that the institution that is meant to protect the country in case of invasion by a foreign power, that even that can be undermined by a fantastical ideology to the extent that it has been. And he went through in the chapter that he wrote for my book, itemizing all of the special measures that have been taken and all of the problems that have been caused. So yeah, it's really an issue. And of course, this isn't to take away from those few women who do have both the physical and the emotional, psychological ability to make a real contribution. All respect to those women, but we know that is a tiny percentage of those who actually serve in combat roles. I think in the US, it's something like 2% of those serving now. In Canada, I think it's even lower. And and all the problems created for men, the constant complaints about sexual harassment and everything else, it's a nightmare. So to think of increasing that at an actual time of war,
really.
is, yeah.
Chaos. One of the things that seems to me to be a possibility is to have all female fighting groups.
That's it. Yeah.
That's fine with me.
I would dissent from that. I mean, I understand the logic behind it. I think they would get slaughtered.
Yeah.
Because the enemy is not going to, any potential enemies for the United States is not going to be stupid enough to send out all female. They're going to send out all males. And I do think they would get slaughtered. I do, however, believe that women have shown competence as fighter pilots in the Air Force and the Navy. There are many support positions they can take that are very important roles to play in a combat theater. There's all kinds of things that women can do. What they can't do, though, is hack through 1.5 miles of jungle with a machete and set 70 pounds on their back. And they can't hook for 30 or 40 miles in the desert. They have different requirements or different limitations. The other thing Janice mentioned was stuff like sexual harassment. There's two things that'll get a woman out of a combat theater, for sure. I mean, other than the normal things like being wounded. but an allegation of sexual harassment will get you out, and pregnancy. And what the military has found is that many women enlist in the service expecting not to be deployed into a hardship area or into any great danger. And when they end up being unpleasantly surprised by that, poof, they magically end up pregnant. And they carry themselves out of the combat theater with full benefits to go back stateside and to be released from the military, but stay paid during the course of their pregnancy. It's amazing.
Wow. Wow.
What a racket that has turned into.
Yeah, really,
and
what a deal.
Fred Reed also documents that in his writing. It is absolutely not tenable. And yet we have a Pentagon who's heavily invested in this narrative. I mean, the generals are all coming out saying yes to women in the draft and to selective service. And their own research is, again, I will find that article, and I encourage everybody to go to the description area to read what he had to say about the Pentagon's own research that proved beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever that women were not fit to serve in combat alongside men. And again, people can take that as an insult to women if they want to. I don't see it that way. It just happens to be this little thing called reality.
Yes. And I think the generals not dissenting is an indication of how bad things are.
Yeah, it sure is.
How
exactly
unable anyone is to be able to give feedback to these people.
Yeah.
You know, it's unbelievable. And maybe it's going to take a couple of 100 female deaths on the battlefield, you know, to turn that around and say, wait a minute, something's wrong here.
I don't know. I mean, this seems like a disaster in the making.
It really does.
I can't see the women ever being deployed in the first place in the event that there were a draft again, God forbid. But, you know, I just can't see it. I see women refusing to go and not being thrown in jail for that.
Right.
I see them being, you know, given all sorts of exemptions for all different reasons, like pregnancy or having children or child-caring roles or some disability or stress or whatever it happens to be. And I just, you know, and that would be covered up as well. And I just, I can't, you know, our societies are not ready to see women coming home in body bags.
Indeed.
That is clear. And our societies are not ready to be putting women in jail for refusing when their names are called up in a draft or for anything like that. So the gynocentrism that we comment on all the time is going to go into overdrive in any situation where women are actually threatened. And it's
like in World War II. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt suggested they draft women in order to get more nurses. And it went to Congress, and Congress actually approved it. But the Senate said, no, we're not going to do that.
But you know what they end up doing, and is exactly what they've ended up doing. If you go back to Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, actually brushed aside all obstacles to women serving in combat roles, allegedly. So they can have this on paper to prove to the world that they're egalitarian minded.
That's right.
Women can do anything men can do, and all the other forms of bullshit you see coming out of PC culture. But at the same time, still over 97% of combat deaths are male. And the reason for this is that they've created the illusion of that type of equality. But when it gets into the theater of combat, they make sure it's just primarily men getting killed. You don't see, you know, you may see women on duty guarding prisoners somewhere in a theater of war, but they're not in the mountains of Afghanistan, rappelling down cliffs with machine guns on their backs. This is the way they're doing this, is they're creating an illusion. They do get the labor that can put women into safer positions. What they do, and of course, like you mentioned earlier, Tom, if one of them gets in trouble, they can dedicate the entire Fifth Army to rescuing them from that and to make sure that they're not among the dead. So the chivalry is still in play. The gynocentrism is still in play. All this is chicken shit politics from the Pentagon. That's it.
Well, And I think from a red pill perspective, the shit is about to hit the fan. Maybe that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Force it out there. Force the discussion to have to happen.
Yeah. I don't know if it ever will. I mean, even in this article, I was struck by how a feminist spin has to be put on everything. There was one part where we're told that somebody named Corey Shake, the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I generally like the American Enterprise Institute.
Right.
She says, I guess Corey is a she says, it's insulting to suggest America's mothers and wives and daughters couldn't contribute. Well, of course it is. That's true. They can contribute and they should contribute. But then listen to what she says. Couldn't contribute, whether the need were rebuilding levees after a natural disaster or repelling an invasion from our shores. Well, I call BS. I do not, if we need levees rebuilt after a natural disaster, it's going to be a disaster in itself. If we've got women primarily responsible for rebuilding them, forget it. And as for repelling the invasion on our shores from a foreign power, I mean, come on, the
I'm stuck.
The military. This notion that the military owes women something, that the military owes it to women to celebrate how powerful, how capable women are by, allowing them into all these positions, or at least claiming that it does. It's nonsense. The military doesn't owe women anything except to be the best fighting force possible. And if we can't have an honest discussion about the problems in integrating women into combat, then the war is over before it's even begun.
Yes.
As usual, your points, Janice, are absolutely cogent and salient, although I do have to criticize you for assuming Corey's preferred pronoun.
That's true. Sorry,
that
Corey.
wasn't fair, but really what we're doing, and again, this is I just call it like I see it. What the Pentagon is up to is giving women in the military the opportunity to strut and say they do everything that men do when they don't.
Yeah.
They still don't do what men do in the military. For the most part, they do not do that. And now every time you talk about our soldiers, you have to say our fighting men and women.
Right.
That's absolutely mandated by everybody, even though over 97% of combat fatalities are male, and the 2.5% that are female are largely from training-related accidents and other factors. They're not from actual combat. But that's what we're doing. We're creating another illusion to please feminists.
Yeah.
And if you talk about the dead in Vietnam, you have to say men and women who gave their lives in Vietnam, even though it's 8 women. But guess what? 72 times as many men get breast cancer as the percentage of women who died in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So men make up about 1% of the breast cancer patients. But no one says the men and women who are getting breast cancer.
Oh, and Medicare won't even cover male.
Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. It specifically only covers female victims of breast cancer. There was a big story about 3-4 years ago. I'll try to find it for the description area, about a man who was denied coverage for his breast cancer from Medicare because he wasn't a woman.
Gynocentrism.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. In any case where women are the majority of something, the men suddenly completely disappear. I was looking at an article in the New York Times that was reporting on a supposed rise in intimate partner homicides. They've been falling for decades, but in the last couple of years, there's been a rise. And it gives the numbers. Says right up front, women are the majority of the victims. The whole article is all about women and how we have to reauthorize the National or the Violence Against Women Act, and all of this stuff, all about women. When you do the number, when you do the math, turned out that 32% of the victims of intimate partner homicides in the year 2017 were men. That's
Yes.
a pretty damn significant number, and yet they're not mentioned once.
And
I tweet.
it doesn't count the men who were murdered by proxy.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah, but
male on
1/3
male.
is a huge percentage.
That's a huge, and I actually
just
tweeted
forget.
that and got all sorts of negative, lay off it. I'll quit it with your male victimization. One feminist actually said that she suspected the majority of those men were killed by men.
Of course.
Yeah. Which is totally untrue. I looked at the report. There are a
We
couple
all
of
die
male in
sometime.
there.
Quit whining.
Yeah, I mean, it really is it's just tremendous how it all works out. So yeah, this is another this is a very concerning thing. It really is. This level of obfuscation and denial and just outright lying is.
And once again, if we look honestly, like looking at what's going on in the Pentagon, we see men at the root of the problem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's exactly right. The chivalrous men.
Yeah.
And the political sellouts. The top brass in the Pentagon is as political as any PAC, as political as any party affiliation. These guys are playing politics, and they're now playing gender politics. It's a disgraceful thing. And these are the guys who are charged with doing everything they can to try to get our troops out of combat alive. That's their job.
Yeah, really.
Is that you engage in wars reluctantly, and when you do have to get into it, you want the force to, one, be as lethal as possible, and two, lose as few people as possible. It's a sacred duty of top brass to approach their job with this, and they're selling out the troops for politics. It's disgusting. And it's not feminists doing this.
Yeah. Good point.
Well, I think they need to take our course on red pill relationships as how to say no to women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the key.
Join us there. We'll put a link to the Pentagon relationships. You can join us there, and we'll help you not be Pentagon top brass.
That's true.
Okay.
I think there.
Yeah.
Are we finished?
We are indeed.
Happy ending.
Happy ending yet again.
Yeah. Well, have a good week anyway, guys.
Indeed, and remember, men
are
good.
So are you. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.